Hi, my name is Jennifer Luarca, and I'm going to go through note-taking and reading strategies with you today. So, we're going to cover in this brief workshop some note-taking styles, some things to think about as you're taking notes. We're going to do a quick reading activity, cover some reading strategies, and then we'll cover a few related study tips. So here we go. The typical note-taking styles that you'll have either heard of or you may use and you just don't know the name are Cornell, sentence or bullet point, concept mapping, and charts. Each one of these styles has its benefits, advantages and disadvantages, so to speak, and certain note-taking styles will lend themselves better to certain subject matters, and I'll touch on that as I review each style. The first style we're going to cover is Cornell. As you can see on the screen, with Cornell Notes, the page is divided into 3 different sections. On the left-hand side is a space that should be left open so you can go back after taking notes and write anticipated questions, main ideas. It's more of what we will call your study space, so things you want to think about as you study. The left, or the larger portion of the page, is going to be dedicated to note-taking. So any style you prefer, we want to be jotting down ideas and notes there. And the last part of the page, or the bottom part of the page, is left open for a brief summary. So the important thing to know about Cornell Notes is the larger portion, where it says notes on the page right here, that's dedicated to in-class note-taking or book note-taking. So that's it, the action of taking notes. That's where the notes are going to go. The left-hand portion, where we write questions, and the summary portion, those are reserved for after class or after notes. So it's almost when you're doing your review of your notes, you're going to be filling in those portions. They're not there for writing during the class. So that's something to think about. If you are going to use this style, you will need to dedicate time either after your lecture or towards the end of the week to go back and fill in those main ideas or questions and the general summary. The next style of note-taking is our most common. It's the sentence method. It's literally writing sentences that you hear as the lecture is taking place. They don't need to be complete sentences, but it's more or less just capturing all of the information that's being discussed. As you see here in this example, I like that this person puts in parentheses, refers to pages that the information can be found on. So you can think about that too as you're taking notes. You can be writing down what you hear, and then within, I'd say, about 24 hours of taking those notes, look back at them, and you can fill in the gaps or make connections between lecture content and the textbook. That's always a wise thing to do, is you want to see what correlates between your lecture and your text. But here, this person has plugged that right into the notes, and that can be very, very useful later. The third style is concept mapping, and this is really something that you would do after you take maybe sentence style notes. Maybe you want to put concepts in order, and if you're highly visual, it may help to create a diagram. So what we see here is the main idea of linguistics, and then we have the different topics. In linguistics is in a circle, and the different topics are in squares. And then those shoot-offs are more lower level ideas related to that topic. So we see this person specifically has written questions related to the idea of phonetics or pragmatics. You can do questions if you'd like. You can also write facts. So you may put the general overarching idea in the center. Again, here it's linguistics. And then you may do the branch off of phonetics. Instead of writing questions, you may want to just write the definition or an example of what phonetics might be. But here you're starting to see visual connections between concepts. So this is really nice if you are going to be responsible for writing essays or short answers on an exam. This style of notes will help you start to think of how information is connected to one another. The last style of note-taking I'll cover briefly is chart method. This is useful if you are doing a lot of comparison and contrast in the course. I see often students in nursing or pharmacology courses using this style of note-taking so that they can create consistent patterns if they're talking about medications, for example. Here we have exercise, and we have the benefits, drawbacks, and opinion. You could do this very easily with concepts under the yellow section, and then under the blue you could put the definition, under the green you could put an example, and under the purple you could put a possible test question. So that's one other way you could format charts. Charts are really, really nice, again, for compare and contrast, to see differences and similarities between concepts. So that's something to think about. It could be very useful for biology, for example. Okay, so those are the different types of note taking, but we want to also talk about, why in general are you taking notes? And if we were in a classroom setting now, I would ask that question and see what people had to say. We're not in that situation, so I will offer the information. Typically, notes are going to be used later for study. So we want to think about it as not something just capturing information from a class or from an online lecture, but really capturing that information so we can use it to study later. So it's really important when we're talking about different styles of note-taking, we want to use one that's going to be meaningful to you and useful. That's why it is helpful to go back and add in questions, charts and diagrams after you've taken the initial notes to make sure that you can use them as you study. Including potential exam questions is always something helpful in your notes. And then similarly, how are you going to study with your notes? I just talked about that, but we would want to say, how are we going to use these notes and how can we make them as useful as possible in terms of using them as a study tool? Oftentimes that's going to be creating a format where you can fold the page and have concept on one side and information on the other, just like as if it were a flashcard. Charts, so that we can cover one column and really test our knowledge that way. So we want the notes to function not only as a place where we capture information, but also a place where we can study later if we need to. And you'll see all of that information's there. So we want to take notes to track lecture, strategize, study, right? And then we will reorganize information, simplify, or create test questions later. How will we know what to write down while we're taking notes? Oftentimes, a good indicator of if something's going to be important in class is if it's repeated. Repetition should cue you that this information is going to be important or potentially on an exam. Enumeration is always a good clue. So if an instructor says first, second, third, that should cue you in that information could potentially be tested, that it's a part of a process or procedure that's important. So really key in on those enumerations. Similarly, steps and orders can be as important to capture, and those are usually going to be enumerated as well. And then any diagrams and charts that are used that the instructor themselves created should be captured in some way, shape, or form. So hopefully you'll have access to those later. You can always ask the instructor to have access to that, or if you could quickly draw the diagram or chart, or even ask, is this in the textbook? Can I have the page number? Because we'll want to reference that. Typically, if things are being sorted into a diagram or chart, thought is there from the instructor's point of view. They see that it's important to differentiate information, which means it is important to you to understand the differentiation. And that is, again, a potential test question. All right, and so keep in mind that when you're taking notes, consistency is really important. So you may take, and really you should take notes differently for each class you're taking. Different classes require different skill sets and different organizational methods. So the way you take notes in a communications course might be different than the way you take notes in a physics course. So you really want to kind of find the proper note-taking style for you in that subject matter and utilize that as much as possible. You also want to think about notations. So if there are certain phrases or topics that are going to be covered continually throughout the course, you may want to develop a symbol or a code so you don't have to write out the entire word. You can just draw a little doodle or picture that represents that concept. And you'll also want to start to build your own library of notation. So for example, it doesn't need to be meaningful to everybody, it just needs to be meaningful to you. So if you want to develop a certain code for a concept, you just need to make sure you remember what that is. There are certain codes or symbols that are typical, like the 3 dots for therefore. But again, in your subject, you may need to develop your own system, and that's fine as long as you can remember what it's used for. Now we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about reading. So what I would like you to do is read through this passage very quickly. I'll give you a minute. Okay, I'm going to switch back to the last slide, and what I'm going to ask is, what was that passage about? I want you to think through what you read and see how many details you can remember from that passage. And go ahead, you can jot them down on a piece of paper or keep them in your mind, but what details do you remember? And then I'm going to put the passage back up, and I'm going to ask you again, what is this about? Looking at the details you remembered, looking at the passage, do you know what it's about? And for the most part, people, when I'm doing this in person, say no, they don't know what this is about. And if I were to tell you this is about flying a kite, and if you read it again, take a second to read it again, knowing that it's about flying a kite. And oftentimes people read through and they go, oh yeah, oh I can see it. And so what I'm going to ask you is, what's at work here? When you read it initially and you don't know what the topic is, this can be really hard, first of all, to remember details or to even place the order of details, right? But once I tell you the topic, it situates a lot nicer in your mind. And the reason is that our memory system really craves overarching structures. So it's important to understand that as you're learning, typically students' learning approach is our first approach at reading this. Focus on read it, get the details, and move on. But as we just experienced, if that's our approach to reading, we're not going to retain a lot and we're not going to understand because we don't understand the topic overall. So what we want to do as we're reading is really get a good picture of the structure of the reading, understand what the topic is before we jump into the details. This may take a little bit of extra time, but it's going to be worth it because details situate better in the memory system if we have an overarching structure for the ideas that we're reading about. So what we want to do is we can look at the topics, right? The titles, the headings, the subheadings. That's a place we can get structure. I also encourage students all the time to really focus on the table of contents as a source of structure of ideas, but also as a way to test ideas. Once you feel like you understand things, you should be able to explain why certain topics are coming before others in the table of contents. So think about that a little bit as we progress through this reading portion. Our goals as we read are always to understand lecture material. The reason it's assigned before we go to class is so that we have a framework to situate details in. Another analogy I like to use is when we do a puzzle, what part of the puzzle do we do first? And typically it's the edges and the outside because we create a frame for all the little pieces to go into. Can we do a puzzle from the inside out? Yes, but it usually takes longer because we don't understand where certain pieces go. But once we have a frame for our puzzle, the details situate faster. And that's the same with reading. Once we have a frame for the ideas we're encountering, they situate nicer in our memory system and they relate to one another much easier. So we want to always approach reading from an idea of understanding. We want to be able to ask questions and participate in lecture, right? And participation in lecture may mean you ask questions and you engage and you talk. Or it might mean that if you're a quiet student, you just sit and you think questions in your head or write them down. Either way, you're engaging and you're thinking deeper about the content. We also want to build those foundations for connecting related concepts or ideas. Just as I discussed the connections in the table of contents, we want to understand why one section comes before the next. And really we do that through reading and understanding the content that way. Okay. Another Reason reading is so important is it helps us to reinforce our neural networks. This is a slide, actually it's 4 slides of a set of neurons as somebody learns new information. And so all the way to the left of the screen is a new learner, someone learning something for the first time. You'll see that there's neurons there, those little branches coming out are called dendrites, and there are some connections between the material. As we progress to the right of this screen, the final slide, the 4th slide, is there's a lot of connections, a lot of understanding. That is a learner who has information in their deep memory systems, right? They can recall information quickly. They can probably do very well on a test because they understand and they've created a lot of neural pathways and connections and thick dendrites to be able to recall. So it's important as you're thinking about reading and studying and taking notes that each of those activities is an opportunity for you to reinforce neural networks and progress towards the right side of the screen, all the way to that 4th slide. That's our goal. Okay, and reading is a tool to get there. Why do we read, or why do we preview the text? So as I said, we want to look at what are we responsible for reading before we jump in and read it. And the reason is it will help us with comprehension. As we discussed, we create a frame for the details, first and foremost. Once we have that frame, the details situate much more efficiently in our memory system. When do we want to preview before we go to class? It's usually 24 hours before lecture. So within 24 hours of going to lecture or listening to a lecture online, we want to go through the content, look at what is there. We would ideally read the text. But even if we can't read, we want to preview the text and kind of go through what the relationships are, what the information is that we're responsible for knowing. And we always want to look at the structure of the structure of the assigned reading. How is reading organized? What are the headings, right? The relationships. Have you heard about these concepts before? We want to activate any prior knowledge. So as we sit in lecture, it's not the first time we're hearing this stuff. We're thinking about it deeply. Okay, and then as we read, we always want to have a goal in mind. Typically, people, when I talk to students, their goal is to read, but we need to go a little farther than that. Our goal would be maybe to answer a few questions or to find an example of a concept that we're interested in, right? If we can pique interest, we are more likely to remember what we're doing. We want to focus on breaking up our readings. So a lot of times I see students who plan to read for an hour straight, and within that hour you're going to have times where you're not focused. So what we want to do is work with our focus time, not against it. If you can stay focused for 15 minutes, then you break your reading up into 15-minute increments with a lot of review and repetition. So we would read for 15 minutes, take a quick physical break, stand up, sit down, look at what we just read, and then add on the new chunk. The repetition helps get information into your long-term memory system, and breaking up the focus time really just helps maximize our efficiency. Okay, and then as you're reading, as you're getting towards the end of the reading, you want to start to test to see what you are retaining. That might be going through concepts, it might be doing chapter review questions, you may have a worksheet that you have to do. You want to just try to test your knowledge. Talk about it out loud, write about it, do something with the information you're learning about.